Hello and welcome to this chess sacrifice video, which I'm doing today because I had a recommendation by a viewer that I talk about sacrifices in chess. When do you know if a sacrifice is good or bad? Well, today I'm going to do at least 10 puzzles here, and all these puzzles are based on sacrifices, and we'll talk about sacrificing pieces or pawns here. There's different ways you can sacrifice. There's different reasons that you can sacrifice. Whether you give up a piece to open lines of attack, for a checkmating attack on the king, or if you do a positional sacrifice where you give something up and you get a better position in return. Maybe you get the material back later, but you end up in a better position. Or if you're already winning, you're just ahead and you give up some material, you give some material back to simplify the position, and you still stay up in material, but now the position is just easier to play for the win. So here we go. We have this first puzzle. A rook has just moved up here and captured a piece or a pawn. I didn't see what the piece was. But with black to move, we're in check. We're being forked here. They're attacking our bishop and our king. Now, what can black do? Well, try to solve the puzzle on your own if you can. Pause the video at any time. All right. So we're going to move our king. Let me get rid of all these arrows. We're going to move the king up here. And the idea in this position is once we move our king here, we cut off these squares in front of our opponent's king. And we're threatening a mate up here by bringing the rook over, checking the king. So we move here. We're not only threatening a mate, but we're attacking this rook. Now here, I guess you could say the sacrifice is that once we go up here, we're sacrificing this bishop. We're attacking his rook, allowing him to just take this bishop and sacrificing that bishop in exchange for a checkmate possibility. So now we have the checkmate. So that was an example of just sacrificing some material because you had a possible checkmate. All right, on to the next problem. And I've set the rating level on these to 1200 and lower. That way beginners that are watching, the positions shouldn't be too complicated. And you can improve your pattern recognition skills while we're going over these puzzles as well. All right, black has just moved, pushing a pawn forward, attacking our pawn. So what can we do here? When you're looking at puzzles, the first thing you want to do is look for any checks. So basically in any position, you should be looking at checks, captures, and threats in that order. Checks first. They're the most forcing, so do we have any checks? We may not even have any checks. So no checks on this king possible. All right, so now captures. What can we capture? And something else to look for with any tactics is, are there any pieces that are unprotected? So we have a rook here that's unprotected. And a pawn over here, I guess. So we should take note of that unprotected rook. Maybe there's a way to go after that at some point. But because this is all about sacrifices, we're looking to see if there is a way that we can sacrifice material somehow and come out ahead. All right. Now, when is it good to sacrifice material? Well, as you gain more experience, you'll be able to calculate better and see if a sacrifice is worth accepting if your opponent wants to sacrifice something, or if it's worth it for you to sacrifice something that'll help you win or gain some advantage. And in general, if somebody's offering you a sacrifice and you can't see why you shouldn't take it, then often it can be a good idea to just grab that extra material. But double check and make sure there's not a trap involved. Okay, so maybe we capture this knight. Okay, they're probably just going to capture with the rook. Then what do we do? Well, I don't know if that works, because if we just capture, they capture. If our queen captures, their queen captures. So that knight has 3 defenders and we have 3 attackers. So the next thing to look at is, can we sacrifice something? What is this knight doing over here? Maybe we can launch that knight over here, attacking the rook, which is one of the defenders of this knight. So if the queen takes the knight, then there will only be 2 defenders here, and we have 3 attackers. So maybe that is an idea to consider. All right, I think that's what I'm going to go for. Sacrifice this knight, and then this gives us some time here to capture, because now if they recapture, then our queen would recapture with a mate here. So that is an example of giving up, temporarily sacrificing that knight in order to regain material, getting a knight back, and then you're left with a better attacking position here. There's this threat of just moving here, delivering a mate. Anyway, let's move on here to the next problem and see what else we have and how we can further discuss sacrificing in chess. All right, we have a bishop dropping back here. All right, first we want to look at the king and look at our checks, captures, and threats. Okay, we have knight and queen, and we have a rook here that may be able to get in on the action. The issue is that maybe, the king can run away. I mean, this knight is under attack by the king. All right, we're looking for sacrifices. Do we just capture? That probably won't work, because then if he captures and we move our rook up here, the king has room to run. Maybe we use this knight, which is under attack anyway, drop it back here and check. The pawn could capture, but if the pawn doesn't capture and the king runs into the corner, then we can just deliver a mate with the queen. So the pawn will probably accept that sacrificed knight. Then that will allow us to start checking that king. All right, we're going to have to do, this is where the calculation comes in. So knight delivers a check. Pawn captures. That opens the king up. So we're sacrificing the knight to open lines up on that king. We deliver a check. The king will start to run. It'll have to come forward, and then we can bring our rook into the action as well. So check, check, and then mate. So good example, and a pattern of sacrifice there, sacrificing the knight to open lines up around that king to kind of wreck the pawn cover. All right, the next problem, what do we have here? All right, so if we're talking about sacrifices, when are they good? When are they bad? Well, as you improve and recognize more patterns, for those of you that aren't familiar with pattern recognition in chess, the more puzzles you solve and solve them more than once, you don't want to just do puzzles and forget about them, but get a series of puzzles, like the 10 in this video, and go over them once nice and slow, and then you can repeat, go over the same puzzles more than once until they start becoming ingrained into your memory, and then you can use them in your own games, and you'll recognize and be able to figure out easier when our sacrifice is good for you or bad, when you should accept a sacrifice or attempt a sacrifice. And it doesn't have to be a piece. We could be talking about a gambit in the opening, the queen's gambit, where you push the pawn in front of your queen, and then the opponent does likewise, and then you push a pawn in front of the bishop on the queen's side of the board, and you offer that pawn up for attack. And if your opponent takes that pawn, it pulls that pawn away from the center. So there are different reasons why you would sacrifice something. All right, what do we have here? The rook has grabbed the open line here. Now, if we're looking at checks first, the obvious possibility would be just giving up this rook here and breaking open the pawn cover. So if the king captured, our queen could move up here, delivering check. The king would have to get off of this line. Oh, but because we have a bishop and another bishop, look at all these pieces lined up on the king here. So once again, it looks like we have a possibility of sacrificing a piece, this rook, to break open lines of attack against the king. So you have to kind of do a little bit of calculation, and as you become better with your calculation, you'll be able to tell if a sacrifice is good or bad. And a shortcut is to solve puzzles regularly and improve your pattern recognition, and then you'll start recognizing patterns, and that'll kind of help you with, maybe you won't have to calculate as much. All right, so we're going to break things open. We're going to bring our queen up here to attack, and then we can deliver a mate here. And so this brings me to a good pattern. Whenever you have a queen on one of the corner squares right next to the enemy king in the center here, the queen will cover both sides unless something is blocking, like this pawn is here. And the queen will also cover this diagonal. So all you have to worry about are the opposite squares on the side, and the bishop covers those. So this is a great pattern to know, in case you have a queen that can go up here after the king. All right, we're almost halfway there. Hopefully you're doing well on these puzzles. And, feel free to leave comments with anything you have to offer, good or bad, positive or negative comments. I don't mind. I like to learn from both, whether it's positive or negative. All right. And if there's a topic here that you would like to see in a future video, leave a comment about that as well. The rook has just moved over here, lining up on our king. But it's white to move. Okay, great pattern here. So take a look at this. We have the white pieces, especially for you beginners out here. There's a lot that can help you in this little puzzle here. Okay, we have a half open file, and we have a battery on that file. So queen and rook. Queens and rook, well, queen does well on open ranks and files and open diagonals as well. The rook, just open ranks and diagonals. But you notice how this battery's on the half open file, and they're aimed up here towards the king side. But the rook doesn't have to go forward and sacrifice by taking this pawn, because then the queen could just recapture and kind of stop the attack. Now, it usually takes about 3 pieces or more, sometimes less, to have a successful attack on your opponent. And here we have a bishop aimed towards the king. We have the rook that could capture this pawn or this pawn. And then we have the queen backing up the rook and also aimed up here. So if we could just get that queen up here to g8, we'd be able to deliver a mate here, backed up by that bishop. And another time you can tell if a sacrifice is good or bad is if you have more pieces attacking than your opponent has defending. So here we have 3 pieces, queen, rook, and bishop, all attacking the king's area. And he doesn't really have many defenders. This queen, I guess, is defending the pawn here. But the knight and rook are a little bit out of play, especially once this rook moved here. All right, so speeding this along, if pause if you need more time to think. But we're going to move this rook and take the pawn. Checking the king, and the king can't go anywhere because of this bishop. So it's pretty much a forcing move. The king, black's pawn will have to capture the rook, and then our queen can move in for the mate. So capture and mate. So once again, we sacrifice a piece, the rook there, to open lines on our king, our opponent's king. Okay. Rook is attacking our queen. What can we do about that? Okay, great little pattern here. Once again, we have a battery of queen and rook lining up here. If only we could just move our queen here and mate. The problem is the bishop is covering that. So what do? Well, if you notice, you have a third attacker lined up here as well. And our opponent just has the bishop defending. So 3 attackers versus 1 defender. I guess the king is helping cover that a little bit, but in general, a lot of times you don't want to count the king in the defense. He helps a little bit, but here, if we could give up one of our 3 attackers, trade it for this 1 defender, and then our remaining 2 pieces could deliver the mate. So pause if you haven't already solved this. If you have, here we go. Queen sacrifice, allowing the rook to capture that bishop defender and deliver a mate here. So a nice little pattern, mating with the rook and bishop as these squares are covered. All right, here we go. On to problem number 7. The rook has just moved over, attacking our rook, trying to fight for the open file. So black wisely, well, we'll see if it's wise or not. He brings in a defender to try and stop the activity on this open file. But maybe white has something here that's going to give black a problem. A problem. We have a queen attacking, a rook attacking. So already we have two attackers. Maybe we have a third with this knight that could possibly jump forward, delivering a check here. Also, a fork possibility. The knight could fork the king and queen. So three attackers. They have two defenders. Now, the pawns, I guess you could kind of count them. And that's where more experience, as you play often, play regularly, and solve tactics. If you can solve tactics daily, do puzzles daily, even if it's just for 10 or 15 minutes a day, that's better than nothing. All right, what are our options? Do we sacrifice the queen? Does that even do anything? The rook will just capture, so I don't see that doing much. So maybe we need to sacrifice this knight. And that still looks like a good move over here. Delivering a check, forking the king and the queen. That pretty much forces black to either give up the queen or capture the knight. So the knight will be sacrificed. The pawn captures. So knight checks, pawn captures, opening up a line of attack with the queen here. The king would have to run, and then we can deliver a mate with the rook capture. All right, so I hope you got that. Try and solve as much as you can, without, try and do as much as you can in your head anytime you're doing puzzles. It's more like a game. You can't really move the pieces around in the middle of a game. You have to calculate it all in your head. So capture, check, and then we deliver. Well, there is this option of blocking with the knight, but then we can just capture and deliver mate there. All right, 3 more to go. What do we have now? The king is running over here to help defend this pawn. Okay, our turn to move. What can we do? All right, we want to look for checks first. What checks do we have? Well, we could check there, but that doesn't sacrifice anything. So if we're going with the sacrifice theme, does this do anything? Just capturing? Well, then the rook or the king could capture there. And the one advantage that we may have is this extra passed pawn up here. But it's going to take 3 moves to get that up and promoted. So maybe we just start pushing that pawn. So if it takes us 3 moves to promote, it'll take him 3 moves to promote, but we'll get our queen promoted first. That gives us time to swing over, deliver a check on the king, and with the help of this rook, that may be enough. All right, I'm thinking we just start pushing that pawn. But what options does our opponent have? I'm thinking we push, and then if they push, we go again. That's probably where the sacrifice is going to come in. We offer them our rook, and that gives us time to promote before they promote their pawn. So here we go. And now because they took our rook, we promote, and their pawn, might not even get a chance to be promoted because now they're in check immediately here. So, that gives us a huge advantage. And you should be winning with that queen versus the rook and pawn here, especially with a king in a wide open center here. All right, let's do the final two problems here. All right, what do we have? Queen attacking queen. Oh, wow. Okay, this is an interesting little pattern. Another important pattern that could come up. I've probably used something similar to this pattern in a few games. All right, our queen is under attack, but we are attacking their queen as well. We could just capture, but then we'll be behind. Well, are we really behind? We have all these extra pawns versus their bishop. So we might already be ahead in material here. Yes, we have way more pawns than the value of their extra bishop. So I guess you could just trade down and have all these extra pawns and hope you can push them through and promote. But since we're already winning, why not sacrifice something to simplify the position and make it even easier for you to win? Okay, so pause the video if you need more time to think. If not, let's look at our sacrifice here. We could bring the rook up here with check. If the king moves, then we just grab, well, if the king moves out of the way and doesn't take our rook, we just capture the queen. So if the king captures our rook, well, then the king's no longer protecting the queen, and our queen can grab their queen. So check, sacrificing the rook, and we capture. So that's another good example of when a sacrifice is good. When you're able to pull a defender away from a valuable square, where here the king was defending the queen, and then we grab that queen. All right, the final problem here. What do we have? A bishop just captured. Now our queen is under attack. Do we let them take our queen and just sacrifice that queen? Maybe we have something better going on. All right. Well, checks, captures, and threats in that order. Do we have any good checks? We have a queen that could capture a knight. We have a rook that could capture this pawn. We have a bishop helping attack here. So 3 attackers, kind of 1 defender. Maybe you could include the rook and the queen, but they're not doing too much defending. They're off to the side a little bit. So the knight really and maybe this pawn are doing the defensive duties here. All right. So which check is better? Can we sacrifice the queen? If we do that, the pawn would capture, and I don't see a good follow-up after that. So maybe we sacrifice the rook. Capture. If the king takes, well, then our queen could take the knight, with check, and the king has two options. You'll see that pattern where, if we look at this, rook captures here. If the king captures, then our queen moves up, and you see that pattern I just mentioned earlier with a queen attacking the enemy king from one of the corner squares. The queen will cover the two sides and the diagonal through the middle. The only thing it will not cover are the opposite squares on the side of this box. So the king would have to run, and either one that he runs to, we could just move up to b2 and mate. So hopefully you got all that, especially the beginners. Now, before we do that, we could look at what happens if we go here and the king does not accept our sacrificed rook. Well, the only options are for the king to run, but then our queen can still capture that knight and mate, I believe. Yes. All right, here we go. Capture, and the sacrifice is accepted. Check, and now mate. So another great example of sacrificing to clear the way for an attack leading to mate on the enemy king. So, when is a sacrifice good or bad? As you gain experience, you'll be able to tell and more easily find the answer to that question in your own games. You can give up a piece, and it's usually good if you get something in exchange, whether that's a good attack on the king, if you're able to give up a piece temporarily and then regain the material or even more material later. So I would just say solve many puzzles. I will do more in this series, more puzzles that involve sacrifices. That way you can get a more clear picture of when sacrifices are good or bad as you solve more of these puzzles. All right, well, I better wrap it up today. I'll wrap it up there for that. Feel free to leave any comments, like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.